Hello. Good morning to our viewers in the Philippines and Thailand, and good evening to those watching us from the US East Coast. I'm Marites Vitug, and I will be the moderator for this webinar on the US elections and its impact on democracy and human rights in Asia. This is organized by the Council for Asian Liberals and Democrats based in the Philippines, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Southeast and East Asia, and Asia Center, both based in Thailand. We are being live streamed on the Facebook pages of the organizers. That's called FNFSEE Asia, Asia Center, and as well as on the Facebook page of Senator Kiko Pangilinan. First, some house rules. During the open forum, participants can ask questions by clicking the raise hand button. You can see it at the bottom of your screen, or by typing your question in the Q&A box. And please state the name of the person you're addressing the question to. You may also post your questions in the comments section of the Facebook live broadcast. Now to our forum proper. A few words about Senator Francis Kiko Pangilinan, who will open the webinar. Senator Pangilinan is chairperson of the Council for Asian Liberals and Democrats, president of the Liberal Party in the Philippines, and a leading opposition figure in the Philippines. Senator Pangilinan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marites. Magandang araw. Good morning from Manila. I would like to thank the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, Southeast and East Asia, and the Asia Center for the next installment of the Future of Democracy in Asia webinar series. I would like to also thank our speakers for joining us today as we discuss the issue 2020 US presidential election. Will it matter for democracy and human rights in Asia? Prior to this webinar, last July 28, we answered the question, or we sought answers to the question, is Hong Kong's present going to be Asia's future? Former Hong Kong Legislative Council member Emily Lau said that, and I quote, "We in Hong Kong will continue with our shrinking freedom, with our shrinking space, to defend our free lifestyle, our rule of law, and to fight for democracy." This has been a looming reality for a number of democracies in the past several years. Like the glaciers in Antarctica, democratic spaces have drastically declined. As the rising global temperatures is to glaciers, so is the rise of elected autocrats to democratic spaces. Shootings and killings, shameless, massive corruption, fake news promotion, and muzzling the people and the press, all while the same leaders enjoy high approval ratings. For most of the last century, the United States has enjoyed the reputation as the world's leading democracy. But the land of the free and home of the brave has been losing the confidence of fellow democracies as Americans face inequality and brutality. In this environment, the question that has been asked time and again is this: is democracy dead? One of the hallmarks of democracy is the duty and privilege of all adult citizens to choose their leaders in an election that is open, free, and fair. 2020 marks a rather challenging year to hold an election. Aside from participating in a major democratic exercise, the United States is also battling a pandemic that has affected over 27 million people worldwide. It is said that when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. So what does it mean for the world when the United States leads in the number of COVID-19 infections at 6.3 million cases as of September 8, when almost 190,000 people have died from COVID-19, when 20 million Americans and counting have lost their jobs, when 3.3 million businesses have had to close shop? Without the pandemic, politics in the world's only remaining superpower would have sucked in most of the world's attention. We would have witnessed vigorous campaigning, furious debates, and packed conventions. Nevertheless, the pandemic cannot relegate us Asians as mere spectators in the horse race narratives of US elections. In more ways than one, we will be impacted by how American people will select the president who will be charged with ending the pandemic's reign of destruction dealing with its aftermath, and leading the nation's recovery from its slide to authoritarianism. The Trump-Biden contest is more than a test of US democracy. While scientists have long rung the alarm bells for concerted global action on the climate crisis, the pandemic has made sure that we all realize that we are all connected. In this webinar, we will try to predict the impact of the outcome of the November electoral contest in the US on how we will be regarded here in Asia, on how the choice of an estimated 156 million American voters for president will impact the exercise of democracy and the protection and promotion of human rights of over 4.6 billion people in Asia, especially the 670 million in Southeast Asia. The US 2020 presidential election presents a crucial juncture on how we will survive as a species. Everyone needs to learn the lesson that one, we are all in this together. And that two, democracy and human rights are the universal principles that will help us out of all this mess. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Senator Pangilinan, for setting the tone for this webinar. May I now introduce our panel of speakers and reactors in the order in which they will speak. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Manpreet Singh Anand, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia during the Obama administration. Currently, he is the Regional Director for the Asia-Pacific region at the National Democratic Institute. He will speak on the subject of continuity and change in American foreign policy towards Asia, a comparison of Trump and Biden. David Timberman joins us from New York. He is Director for Asia Programs at Freedom House. He's an old Philippines and Southeast Asia hand, having written books and articles on this part of the world. David has worked with the Asia Foundation, Asia Society, USAID, and the National Democratic Institute. His talk will be on the next American presidency, implications for democracy and human rights in Asia. Our reactors are Mu Sokua. She joins us from Rhode Island, where she has been on self-exile for more than 2 years. Ms. Sokua is the Vice President of the Cambodia National Rescue Party and former chairperson of the CALD Women's Caucus. She's also a former member of parliament in Cambodia, and she was a member of the cabinet as well in the late 80s as Minister of Women's Affairs. James Gomez joins us from Singapore. He's Regional Director of the Asia Center in Thailand and Malaysia. He's a political scientist and human rights specialist, and in the last 25 years, he worked for various international NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, universities, and think tanks. In July 2020, James was a candidate of the Singapore Democratic Party in his country's parliamentary elections. The speakers will have 10 minutes each. So let's start with Manpreet. Manpreet, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be speaking alongside these other distinguished panelists as well. Just at the outset, I'd like to make it clear that I am speaking in my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization and certainly not any campaign. Of course, that doesn't mean I don't have my own biases, which I think will come out to be very clear in the next few minutes. But what I thought I would do in these 10 minutes is three quick things. First, I think it's important to take a step back and examine President Trump's foreign policy for what it is and what it has been. Second, I'll talk through what Vice President Biden has said he would do with an affirmative and progressive foreign policy agenda. And then third, I'll discuss some specific things that I think we can look forward to in a Biden administration that would inform his policies towards the Asia-Pacific region. And to answer the senator's question about whether democracy is dead, I don't think democracy is dead, but I think it is on the ballot this November here in the United States. There are some real big questions that I think our country is asking itself for in this election. So starting with the Trump foreign policy, as I thought about how to organize my thoughts for this conversation, it occurred to me that there's really no real doctrine or Trump foreign policy that you can point to in a strategic way. That at its worst, it's actually been self-serving and impetuous, with negative effects on US national interests. And here are I would say, 4 different ways in which that has been the case. First, it's damaged US leadership and reputation around the world. You have to ask yourself the question, who looks to the US for leadership on any major international issues? And which countries actually trust us to follow through on our commitments? The statistics cited by the senator regarding the pandemic only prove this case. So it's difficult to point to any real sustained or good foreign policy outcome that has come out of the Trump administration. Instead, we've seen trade wars with no results to show for them. We've seen a failure to act on global challenges, ranging from climate change to mass migration to the pandemic. And there really is no regard for strategic relationships. Everything is thought of in a transactional manner. The second category is really how the Trump administration has sought to dismantle critical institutions. And this includes internally. The basic US foreign policy apparatus have been attacked, including career diplomats and officers. The president has turned his back on our very own foreign policy assets, whether they be our personnel here at home or abroad. He's denigrated longstanding alliances, key alliances like NATO, or treaty allies like Japan or Korea. And in South Korea's case, even scaling back joint exercises at the request, it seems, of the dictator in North Korea. He's also walked away from multilateral agreements and institutions. Who walks away from the World Health Organization during a global pandemic? Well, apparently President Trump does. We've also seen him on day one walk away from a carefully crafted climate accord, the Paris Climate Deal, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a key multilateral trade arrangement that had far-reaching consequences for the Asia-Pacific region. And the travesty of it all is that there are no real alternatives that have been put in place on any of these actions. The third category really is around values and interests. What does America stand for under a Trump foreign policy? You know, when I was at the State Department, we talked about how good foreign policy exists where American values intersect with American interests. But in the Trump administration, values have been distant from American interests. And unfortunately, the president has not been a champion for democratic values, instead cozying up to dictators and revealing his own authoritarian tendencies. And that gets me to the last category. It really is uncanny how President Trump is using the same authoritarian playbook within the United States, concentrating executive power, trying to co-opt elites through patronage or punishment, inflating or inventing threats so that people feel afraid and therefore gravitate towards strongmen, otherizing people of color or people of different faiths or people from different countries. And now, unfortunately, we even see it in election manipulation, defunding the Postal Service during a pandemic and spreading misinformation day in and day out. Now, this paints a pretty gloomy picture. So let me turn to what I think of President Biden would do to try to create the right enabling environment for a positive foreign policy agenda. First, I think he would have to restore American leadership for democratic values. It will have to be a foreign policy that is centered on democracy. Second, I think he'll look to revitalize strategic relationships with treaty allies and partners. We know the world does not organize itself, and the US can play a critical role, as it has done in the past, to show leadership in areas that otherwise more malign actors will seek to fill the vacuum. I think that Vice President Biden believes strongly in US leadership, but in a very different way than President Trump. one that will place a premium on international collaboration and cooperation to address global challenges. Third, I think he'll look to rebuild the foreign policy foundation in the United States, the diplomatic corps in particular. And fourth, he will have to recreate economic opportunities for Americans through pro-growth and pro-poor policies so that they can inform much of our foreign policy agenda. Just talking about specifics in the last couple of minutes that I have, Vice President Biden often says, the US should lead by the power of our example, not just the example of our power. And that means starting with key policies at home. That means ending the cruel and bigoted policies that have sought travel bans on the basis of religion or put kids in cages on the basis of their country of origin. That means stop talking and acting like the press is the enemy of the people. That means not running roughshod over our systems of governance and democratic institutions and checks and balances and democratic norms. That means criminal justice reform and voting rights and rooting out corrupt practices and the systems that enable that type of institutionalized corruption. He will have to put corruption as a core national security issue, and he has talked about doing just that. So it will be a foreign policy that is driven by democratic values, social justice, innovation, and economic security at home, so that we can get our own house in order, because the world is watching to see if we are willing to lead again. That also means that it will be prioritizing those foreign policy issues that have been ignored and mobilizing partners to address those global challenges. And in the last minute, I'll just tick off a few of those. Health security, of course, because of the pandemic, climate change and climate security, nuclear nonproliferation, and yes, of course, confronting China. Now here, I think that we have to talk about an American position towards China from a position of strength by restoring kind of the fundamental values of America. It's not about competing with China in a new Cold War. It's actually about having a more balanced space with China, where we can cooperate where possible, compete where advantageous, and counter where necessary. I know that these seem like geopolitical choices, but they're not. They're choices between democratic values or authoritarianism, choice between rule of law or rule by dictator, and a choice about economic opportunity for all or economic largesse for those in power. These are the choices that are on the ballot in November. I look forward to the rest of the panelist discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Manpreet. Next speaker, David, please, it's your turn.
Great, okay. Great, thank you, Mary Tess. And thanks to, let me also express my thanks to the organizers. It's a genuine honor to be included in this program, in part because it involves a few old friends like Mary Tess, but also because of the other distinguished panelists, Senator Pangilinan, and of course, Vice President Robredo when she joins us. As someone who spent a lot of time in the Philippines, I just wish I could be doing this in Manila rather than here in New York. By way of brief introduction, for those of you who aren't familiar with Freedom House, we're a nonprofit and nonpartisan, non-governmental organization founded in 1941, one of the earliest human rights organizations in the US, with the goal of supporting human rights and democracy globally. We do this through a combination of research, such as our annual Freedom in the World report, which is pretty widely known, advocacy, but also providing support to human rights defenders and capacity building to civil society in countries around the world. I've been asked to address the implications of the next American presidency for democracy and human rights in Asia. And I think what I have to say will complement what Manpreet just said, in that I think I'll be able to bore down a little more into sort of American interests and capabilities, and perhaps how some of this relates more specifically to Asia. So as we know, in the US and elsewhere, who's president matters hugely. I mean, we've seen that in the Philippines, we've seen that in the United States, we've seen it in lots of places. But rather than focusing on the two individuals vying for the presidency in the US right now, I think it might be more useful, if perhaps a little less colorful, to offer a simple framework for understanding the different ways that presidential administrations can influence democracy and human rights, particularly, I mean, generally, but particularly in Asia as well. So hopefully this framework, which I'm about to just describe quickly, will enable the listeners to understand the key components of what's really a bundle of things that determine the US government's policies with regard to democracy and human rights. So my framework has 5 elements to it, some of which Manpreet's touched on. They are, first, what the US government's perceived geopolitical interests are in the Asia Pacific. Second, the extent to which America is still an exemplar or a model for democracy and human rights. Third, presidential rhetoric concerning democracy and human rights. Fourth, the resources that an administration has available to support democracy and human rights. And lastly, the tools that an administration has to use to support democracy and human rights. So going from the rather broad to the quite specific and instrumental. I'll comment briefly on each of these and then conclude by identifying what I see as a few changes that there might be if there's a new presidential administration. So first, on the US government's perceived geopolitical interests, as Manpreet mentioned, clearly countering China's growing influence in Asia and globally has become a central concern of US national security policy. As a result, the US government has not pressed strongly, at least not publicly, for greater democracy and human rights in countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and that's just to name a few. Personally, I don't see the geopolitical perspective changing fundamentally under a democratic administration. I think I disagree here with Manpreet. So I suspect we'll continue to see a desire on the part of the US government to maintain good relations with semi-authoritarian governments if that's considered to be in the national security interest. This doesn't mean that there won't be a greater emphasis on human rights. There almost, if there's a Biden administration, there will be. But it does suggest that the likelihood for how fundamental a change there will be is perhaps not as great as perhaps Manpreet is suggesting. Second, with the extent to which America is still an exemplar of democracy and human rights, I mean, this issue, of course, it's societal in scope and not the responsibility of any one presidential administration. It's much larger than that. And certainly over time, we've certainly lost some and maybe a lot of our sheen in this area. But if there's a silver lining to this, I think it's that we're now more inclined to recognize, reflect on, and I hope address our own national shortcomings and problems. I mean, the multiple challenge and issues that we're currently facing, I think has really, it's impossible not to really do that for us now. So it's a potentially positive development for Americans and ultimately for US policy to realize that in many ways, we're just another country trying to address the imperfections of its democracy. And that opens up the possibility for equal partnerships, perhaps more cooperation, more empathy maybe, a number of things. Third, presidential rhetoric concerning democracy and human rights. Now, when I use the term rhetoric, I'm not being dismissive of rhetoric. Clearly what a president does or doesn't say can have very significant impact. So words matter. And it can be supportive of democracy and human rights, or of course it can, words or silence can undermine democracy and human rights. But for presidential rhetoric to be credible and impactful, it has to be consistent with behavior and in alignment with the administration's behavior. So that gets us sort of to resources and effective tools. So fourth, on the resources, presidential leadership, again, is very important. But for those listening who aren't familiar with the American political system, it's also important to remember that it's the US Congress that appropriates money. Fortunately, in our Congress, there has been and continues to be a core of bipartisan support for democracy and human rights policies and programs. And this core support has, in fact, helped to withstand some of the attacks on these programs and policies by the current administration. But it's also important to remember that the next administration, like administrations in many countries, will face serious fiscal challenges due to the pandemic. And so, there will be serious debates over what resources there are available and where they should go. So finally, regarding effective tools, in addition to resources to have impact, you need to have effective tools. And US administrations have quite a few of these to draw on if they want to. I mean, these include some that many of you are familiar with: governmental and non-governmental organizations that can support democracy and human rights, public and private diplomacy that is sustained, sophisticated and credible, increasingly importantly, sophisticated digital and strategic communications capabilities, and both the ability to use both incentives and sanctions as when necessary. So every administration has choices about how to use these tools. And one of those important choices, as Manpreet has also already suggested, is whether they can or should be used unilaterally or multilaterally in concert with other governments. So that's sort of the framework by which I think about and try to untangle the possibilities. So let me conclude with what I think we might see if there's a Biden presidency. First, if Biden is elected president, he'll come into office with an extensive and experienced foreign policy team. And this is, of course, a huge difference from what was the case when Trump came into office. And as a result of this, there should be a more coherent foreign policy to begin with, in general. Second, again, perhaps disagreeing with Manpreet somewhat, I believe we'll see a continued reluctance to push too hard on democracy and human rights in countries where the U.S. government doesn't want the other government to become too much closer to China. And personally, as someone who's been involved in the Philippines for a long time, I'll be watching to see how this plays out in U.S.-Philippine relations once there's a new administration confronting the final year or so of Duterte administration. Third, I'm sure we will see stronger and more genuine presidential rhetoric in support of democracy and human rights. Again, Vice President Biden has been very clear about this already, and I'm sure it will continue. Fourth, reflecting the Democratic Party's domestic constituencies, I think we'll probably see a return to a concern with a broader range of human rights, such as including LGBTQ and labor rights, for example. And this is maybe a longer conversation, but we may also see a different take or approaches how to address issues of religious freedom, at least relative to the way the Trump administration has approached those. And then finally, as Manpreet already mentioned, we'll definitely see a return to more multilateral approaches to, foreign policy in general, but also promoting democracy and human rights. So I think my time is up and I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, David. Anyway, we expect to have more questions coming up later. Okay, now Manpreet painted stark choices, democracies in the ballot in November. David gave a 5-pronged framework. So can we ask now our reactors to speak? We start with Ms. Mu Sakua.
Thank you, Tess. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for giving us this platform to discuss the very important topic, of course, the elections in the United States this coming November. For Cambodia, the US elections have special significance as these elections will shape the policies of one of the key signatories of the Paris Peace Accord signed on 23rd October 1991. The United States, with its involvement as a significant signatory of the Paris Peace Accord, has undertaken not only to play a role in the future development of the Cambodian liberal democracy, but to be its guarantor. While it is solely the responsibility of Cambodians to freely elect our own government, our own leader, it is a joint responsibility of the US and the signatories of the Paris Peace Accord to ensure that genocide will never happen again on the Cambodian soil, that brutal dictatorship will never be repeated, and that the constitutional liberal democracy will thrive in the Kingdom of Cambodia. Cambodians, like the rest of the world, look at the US with full attention and eyes wide open, especially the coming elections. We want to see the White House as we have known it in the history, being the great defender of the core pillars and institutions of national democratic values, from respecting freedom of the press to protecting and securing the sacred right to vote, to upholding judicial independence. The US is needed to reinforce its commitments in 3 areas: fighting corruption, defending against authoritarianism, and advancing human rights across the world. All these is essential in the case of Cambodia, which is considered as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, with authoritarianism drifting towards brutal dictatorship and with blatant breach of human, civil, and political rights. Today, Cambodia, the leaders of Cambodia, Mr. Hun Sen himself, cannot even accept one young woman walking alone, ask him to see him, to meet with him, to talk about what? To talk about the environment. And a group of young activists are now behind bars. He started by dismantling the opposition, my party, our party, and the game, his game of facade democracy goes on and on and on. That's why the US elections are important to us. The US has to be the leader in combating corruption as a core national security matter and lead the efforts internationally to bring transparency to the global financial system and seize stolen assets. Here, I have to be grateful to the US administration for putting a number of high-ranking officials of the Hun Sen government on its blacklist by using the Magnitsky Act. But we hope that at the next election, administration, whoever will lead the next administration, this list of those who have undermined democracy in Cambodia or elsewhere in the world, the blacklist will be there will be more names and there will be more action, so that the seizure of stolen assets will make it more difficult for leaders like Mr. Hun Sen, who steal from their people, to hide behind anonymous front companies. The US has to lead in protecting human rights and democratic principles in cooperation with the democratic allies, using all international fora, it be the UN, the UN Human Rights Council, and ASEAN, especially ASEAN. ASEAN has to be challenged. And with the US speaking with one voice, with other democratic allies, we hope that there will be some kind of changes in ASEAN as far as protection of human rights of the people of ASEAN are concerned. The upcoming presidential elections in the US are indeed crucial for Cambodia, for Southeast Asia, and for the rest of the world. Democracy is at stake both in America and in the world. That is why our strong, on behalf of my party, it is, and on behalf of millions of Cambodian freedom-loving people, to the American voters, be vocal, don't stay at home. Go out and mail in your vote and vote for America that is a leader in the world. The United States is needed to lead the democratic world, not just with the example of its power, but also with the power of its people. It is really, really a special moment for me to be saying this, reminding American voters to be vocal, don't stay at home, go out or mail in your vote and so on. As a Cambodian, as an opposition, as a leader, a political leader, because of the fake or so many fraudulent elections in Cambodia and all the parts of the world. And the world is very anxious about what is going to happen in the elections in the United States this coming November. Finally, 2020 elections is a defining moment for the American people to make a choice not just leadership, but for America to find a direction together, to find common ground, to deal with the real dangers that are challenging the core values of the American people, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation. I was speaking as a Cambodian leader, politician, but I am also an American citizen. So I am in exile in America, a free country. Now it is also my responsibility to act as an American, because my vote will count, because America gave me a chance to have an education when I came here in 1975 as a student. And now America is asking itself the very defining question: what is democracy? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Mu Sokua, voice from Cambodia, yet you understand US politics very well. So may I now call on our next reactor, James Gomez.
Yes, thank you very much. My perspective will come from the work that we do at the Asia Center. Asia Center undertakes evidence-based research to help its partner realizing directions for programming, such as capacity building for stakeholders, as well as advocacy campaigns to influence policy decisions. Our natural partners are the UN and its different agencies, INGOs, CSOs, parliamentary or political party networks, as well as academic institutions. Today, I have a slide, if I may be allowed to share the screen briefly. I have 4 points here. I'm unable to share the slide, so if the organizers can help. Okay, notwithstanding that, I'll just proceed here. So I have four comments that I want to share, or 4 areas that require attention in Southeast Asia. I think overall, I think the discussions has taken a very statist approach, and I think that's just one dimension of the picture. So I would like to sort of also think about some of the non-statist approach and how that is important for democracy and human rights. First of all, I think we do have the free and open Indo-Pacific policy around shared values on how we organize free and open societies. I think, in keeping with the statist approach, one question, regardless of who becomes president of the US, is how is the US partnership with India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand that seem to kind of be a little bit more aligned in terms of the values. In particular, I want to point out South Korea and Taiwan because they have in the recent years been convening meetings and supporting civil society in particular. So I think that's an important area we need to look at to see whatever the administration that comes into the US, what kind of impact it will have with these particular partner countries, and would such convening in support of civil society go beyond South Korea and Taiwan. Secondly, it is expanding again on Indo-Pacific area, expanding track 2 involvement. Now, the US and Taiwan have the Indo-Pacific Democratic Governance Consultation. We have seen in the last year that track 2 involvement has been integrated. It includes track 2 participants beyond the US and Taiwan. It actually brings in participants from the larger Indo-Pacific region. Can these consultations again move beyond Taiwan, at least in the first instance, also consider South Korea? And really naturally, it also looks at whether the Philippines can play a role, which it has traditionally been a country where civil society meetings have been convened. So that's the first area. Secondly, what are the key democratic and human rights issues for the region? If we look at the US, I think the overarching concern has been China's impact on democracy and human rights. And I think a lot of the concern and projects have been about trying to understand these specific impacts. I think most of the activities or ideas coming out has been to try to map China's impact in the region, in particular in Southeast Asia, whether it's in terms of the number of students, what kind of businesses, beyond, and what kind of influences these things have, including the influence of Confucius. Then there are some key issues in which US implementers are involved in, partner implementers, such as around the issue of freedom of religion and belief, peace and conflict, and also working with parliamentarians and political parties. What I want to highlight here is really that the issues are quite thin and limited. And I think then this leads to the gap around issues of democracy and human rights that needs to be addressed regardless of which administration comes into power. First, I think we need to talk about institutionally strengthening civil society. 2, issues related to freedom of assembly and association, issues related to freedom of expression, and of course, COVID-19. I think what the COVID-19 issue brings to the fore is the kind of impact crises in the region have had on democracy and human rights. we traditionally speak about the waves of democratization, but really I think what we need to think about is the waves of regression, and most of the waves of regression are signposted by global crises and how they trickle down into the region, whether it's starting from the work of Asia Center, starting from the financial crisis of 1997, we've seen a trend going on through the tsunami, SARS, the 2008 global financial crisis, September 11, and also right now with COVID, some key patterns. During all these crises, what we see is some key features: the introduction of emergency laws, and then its extension well beyond the period of crisis. Then we see a rise in surveillance of citizens, and third, we see the interference with democratic agencies. And finally, post crisis, we see a consolidation of rules and regulations that effectively shrink civic space. What we also see during this period, and not very clearly articulated, it's the fumbling by donor agencies. Every time the crisis breaks out, donor institutions are unable to respond in an agile and flexible manner. It will take them between 3 to 6 months to get a sense of where the crisis is. They are often bottled down by their SOPs and protocol. And by the time they kind of put their head out, I think a lot of the space that need to be engaged is kind of closed off. And this, I think, has been one of the reasons why civil society has suffered a setback in terms of the impact of successive waves of crises that have impacted the region. Still on point 3 around gaps, it's the implementation challenges. You will find US NGOs and consultancy firms are very heavy in the implementation of key democracy and human rights issues. Local partners are important, but they play a very, very small role, and their participation into such processes are slow and very cumbersome. Usually, when an award is granted, it will take the chief of party and company almost a year to do their scoping before they can even begin to put out any calls for projects. And I think that's a real implementation challenge in the region that also, one has to be mindful regardless of which administration comes in. So circling back to my main point, I think, in talking about the US, the elections, and its impact on the region, we are still very much taking a statist approach. I think we also need to look beyond the state and work with civil society, and therefore helping enlarge that space is important. The range of issues has to be expanded beyond, what's is currently being taken up, such as freedom of religion, peace and conflict, and also to be very well aware of the reverse influence that's taking place in the US. This is something also that's not talked about. You will find that many of the partners of the US who are authoritarian or semi-authoritarian have a big footprint in Washington, in New York. They buy into institutions, they fund, academic chairs, they provide resources to organize events and activities. where their leaders come and, speak at platforms. These are things that are not known in the region unless you are based in the US or you have enough, oversight over some of the things that happen in Washington. So with that, I'll stop there as my reaction to the speakers so far. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for also stressing the challenges that civil society in the region face and the values that they espouse. So we're now opening the floor. We have so many questions. What I'll do is I'll read first, I'll group them into three and address, these are addressed to the first two speakers, to Manpreet and David. From Miguel Gaspar, please just remind the speakers to be brief in their responses so we can accommodate more questions. From Miguel Gaspar, with Joe Biden introducing on one of his platforms called Green New Deal, when it addresses inequality, segregation, and the environment simultaneously, how would this platform affect relations with the Philippines? And the second and third questions are, do you think a Biden win would favor the Philippines and put a full stop to the China pivot of the Philippine government? And the third question also says that Manpreet and David seem to assume that Biden will win the elections. And what if Trump manages to win the Electoral College? What then for the relationship and dynamics in Asia? So three questions first for Manpreet and David.
Thank you. Maybe I'll take the last one and leave the implications on the Philippines to Dave, given his longstanding experience. But you're right. We didn't really talk too much about what would it look like if the president is reelected. And it's hard to say. I mean, I think because there has not been a strategic outlook on the Trump administration's foreign policy. It has been erratic, at times self-serving, at times personality-driven. It's hard to say what direction it would take, other than we can expect to see more chaos. We can expect to continue to operate in a world where US leadership takes a back seat, where authoritarians feel emboldened, and where democratic values are run over by transactional and otherwise self-serving interests from the president himself. And so it's a bit of a bleak picture in my mind, including for our long-standing allies and partners in Asia.
Yeah, so these are some difficult questions for 10 p.m. in the US, but I'll do, and it's just the start, but I'll do my best. Just to add to what Manpreet just said, yeah, I mean, well, I didn't totally assume that that it would be a Biden victory, but the idea I think has been, what would change look like? So that's I think what we were addressing. But were Trump to win again, I mean, one thing is, I think there will be a serious legitimacy crisis in the political legitimacy crisis in the United States, and what the ripples are for that, through everything, through the economy, through foreign policy, you name it. I mean, the Philippines knows what legitimacy crises are like. So for those who are in the Philippines, they can have a very serious negative impact on lots of different aspects of a nation. And I think we could very well face that if with it, there's a lot of speculation on what an electoral outcome will look like. But and yes, I agree with Manpreet. We'll see, continue to see erratic and highly transactional, and highly personalistic foreign policy. What we've seen pretty much all along, I think. But beyond that, with regard to specific policies, I'm not sure, because again, it is so erratic that you could see, you know, almost a complete reversal on a policy regarding China or some other country, right? Because of the nature of the policymaking process. Biden and the Philippines, it's a question from a Filipino, right, Mary Tess? I believe.
Yes, yes.
I believe so. So, I mean, one thing that's important for Filipinos to understand is that, and I hope I say this in a sympathetic way, the US looms a lot larger to the Philippines than the Philippines looms to most US policymakers. So, and as I've already said, I'm not sure we will see a fundamentally different approach to current US policy towards the Philippines, even if there's a change in administration. I mean, there will be some changes on the margins. You know, you're not going to have a President Biden inviting President Duterte to the White House. You know, you may hear more statements about and more expressions of concern about EJKs and human rights violations, those sorts of things. But I'm not sure there'll be a fundamental change if Biden wins. But also to the point about full stop regarding China, you know, at the end of the day, Filipinos are going to determine what they want their relationship to be with China. And again, I mean, the US can be a supporting actor in that or not. But at the end of the day, that's up to Filipinos really to determine. So that I don't really can't say more than that. Regarding the New Deal, and Manpreet, maybe you can help me here. I'm not so sure that Biden has actually endorsed the Green New Deal. I mean, there's a lot of chatter about this sort of what he's endorsed and what he hasn't endorsed. And I had, to be honest, I just haven't thought about what the potential, if that is in fact the case, what the potential impacts might be for the Philippines. I can't say, I can't respond to that.
Well, maybe I'll just make a quick comment on that. I think perhaps not the legislation of the Green New Deal, but Vice President Biden and Senator Sanders came together after Vice President Biden was the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party and put together a number of joint working groups to look at a number of public policy issues, one of them being focused on climate, and many elements of the Green New Deal were incorporated within that platform. So perhaps that's what the questioner was referring to. But I agree with you, David. It's too early to tell how implementation of such a broad policy imperative will actually affect specific countries, other than to say that climate will be front and center as a main foreign policy priority under a Biden administration in a way that it has been just completely absent, and actually worse than absent, it's been denigrated by the Trump administration. So I think we could look forward to actually having a true partnership in dealing with this existential crisis for the globe.
Okay, thank you. I will read two questions on China, and then after which I will direct questions to our two reactors. The first question on China comes from Emily Lau in Hong Kong. She would like to ask the speakers about, I think this refers to Manpreet and David, President Biden's policy on People's Republic of China. Because some people are saying that Biden would be much softer on the Chinese Communist Party in areas of human rights and rule of law because his son's business interests in China. But they also fear the Democratic Party is also soft on the CCP's violation of human rights. Is this perception wrong? And then there's one more China question from Axel Matriano. The Chinese Communist Party is violating human rights in Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Hong Kong. Shouldn't the US sanction the Chinese economy, as their rise can cause a threat to democracy? So two China questions for our speakers from the US, and then I will direct questions to Ms. Sokua and James. So who goes first, Manpreet?
Sure. On the first question, let me answer it this way. there has been a real effort to spread misinformation by the Trump campaign about Biden's response or supposed response to China or his approach towards China if he were to get elected. This comes from an effort, a well-orchestrated effort to try to create both fear and distraction. Fear towards China and the Chinese people, which has translated into some really disgusting xenophobia and xenophobia acts actually within the United States, but also a distraction to try to distract from the real failures that the Trump administration has had in responding to the pandemic, and therefore trying to blame China for the inadequate response that the United States has had to the pandemic. So the kinds of comments that are made in that question, or the assumptions or presumptions that are made in that question, really stem from an active misinformation campaign waged primarily by the Trump administration and his supporters. Trump campaign, I'm sorry, let me clarify, Trump campaign and his supporters. The second question I didn't quite get, maybe I'll turn it over to Dave and I'll try to read it in the Q&A.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I agree with what Manpreet just said, but in addition to that, there's been in my view, a fairly fundamental sea change in views both in the among Americans, but also among American political leadership, about how to think about China and the threat or threats that China poses, or challenges that China poses. And that's a shift that has taken place among, certainly some elements in the democratic foreign policy, establishment as well. I mean, I think there are debates among democratic foreign policy experts on, this huge, very difficult challenge, a question of how to manage, how to engage with China. So that's just a large, difficult challenge. But being soft, I mean, I'm not really sure that being soft is really even an option for anybody these days because of this something of a political shift. And so in addition to in addition to what Manpreet said, I don't think the kind of the reality of thinking among policymakers is that you are soft on China. It's as Manpreet suggested early on, it's, in what ways do you try to contain China? In what ways do you try to cooperate with China? In what ways do you try to counter China's influence in other places? So what that is suggesting is a very complex and sophisticated policy towards China, which in a sense is a return to what the thinking that existed before, but I think with a stronger sense of of China's increasing power and influence and the challenges that poses. With regard to the sanctions, the U.S. government already, has imposed sanctions both on Chinese leadership and on corporations, leadership with regard to Xinjiang and the crisis facing Uyghurs there, but also more recently in Hong Kong. So, sanctions are in fact actively being used. They're not, well, with the exception of the trade war, the sanctions, as we understand sanctions, in terms of visas and restricting movement or seizing assets or limiting specific companies from doing things. Those more specific sanctions, some of those are already happening. In addition to the larger issue of the trade war.
Okay, David, you're done?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now there's a question, maybe James, you'd like to answer this. It says for anyone, but it refers to Asia. So to what extent can it be said that the leadership and actions of Trump have set an example and inspired leaders in Asia? And would a Biden presidency be able to rectify such tendencies and restore its past standing in the region? And there's a question I would like to read for Ms. Sokua. Given that some ASEAN member states are leaning towards the leadership of China with regard to the economy, how do you think the US under Biden or Trump will persuade the organization to go towards the US? So that's one question for James. And I think the final question for Ms. Sokua if we run out of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Marites. I think the US has over a long period of time suffered brand damage. So, and I think even if Biden comes in and there's a shift to multilateralism and other approaches in relation to issues of democracy and human rights, it's a brand damage that will take some time to repair. So I think that's the first position. Secondly, the authoritarian regimes here and the behaviors of the leaders, you know, I think they have a bit more tenacity given that someone else, you know, in the US is also, you know, misbehaving, so to speak, especially when it comes to race relations and things like that, you know, so hate speech, fake news. So these has been sort of been the modus operandi in many parts of Asia, where you'll find leaders, government officials are part of the hate speech and fake news regime. They don't hesitate to do that. And then they set up laws in which they themselves cannot be prosecuted, but they use those laws to prosecute those who would criticize them. So from that perspective, I think in spite of whichever administration that comes in, if it's positive and there can be some support from a state point of view, that's great. Changes in foreign policy usually are large wheels that take a long time and they turn very slowly. So my message is really, while we could benefit from the change of wind, much of the democratic forces and human rights champions are very much embedded among the activists and civil society, and they will need to continue come what may. And as long as we are champions of our own destiny, and along the way when there's support, when we can get it, that'll be great. And really that's what I'm kind of trying to say this discussion today.
Thank you. Ms. Sokua, please answer the question on ASEAN leaning towards China and how can they move to the US, towards the US?
When President Obama came to Cambodia in 2012, not as a state visit, but to attend ASEAN meeting, and ASEAN meeting at that time was chaired by Cambodia. And that was the first time ever that the ASEAN did not have a statement after the meeting, because Cambodia, Hun Sen himself, was being a good friend of China. And today, China is even more present in Cambodia. So the administration of the US administration, whichever party will win the next election, will have to deal with this issue and be very, and not take Cambodia or a small country like Cambodia as a piece, as a sideshow, but put it in the context of the region, ASEAN, and to really, and to pull in and work with the other ASEAN democratically elected governments to be on the side of the US and on the side of the people of Cambodia, or the people of ASEAN. So definitely in terms of with China, standing very firmly with the people of ASEAN. The peoples of ASEAN want allies that are strong on and firm on democratic values, on liberal values, on human rights, and not just looking inwards as a geopolitic game. It is time for the US administration to speak and to stand firmly with the peoples of ASEAN.
Thank you, Ms. Sakuwa. We have time for one last question. So maybe the speakers can answer the thousands of questions in writing. Let me just take one final question, both for Manpreet and for David. This is from Butch Abad, former Philippine Budget Secretary. His question is, won't the influence of progressive Democrats like Senators Warren and Sanders, which has pushed Biden to the left, would they have a significant impact on his foreign policy, particularly human rights and democratic development, in case he wins the US presidency? So,
sure, I'll take a quick stab at that. So I think a progressive domestic agenda will drive changes in foreign policy, but perhaps not for the reasons people immediately think about. You know, a big mantra that Vice President Biden has used in his campaign has been "Build Back Better," in an effort to talk about how issues of economic disparity and inequality, issues of social injustice, issues of immigration are going to be addressed through a more comprehensive way that are based on fundamental American values of equity and opportunity for all. And I think having that type of domestic agenda will absolutely inform a US foreign policy agenda under a Biden presidency. And that will have knock-on effects in the way in which democracy and human rights issues will be formulated in US foreign policy. So I think that's the connection that we ought to be looking for.
okay, David.
Yeah, again, I mean, Manpreet is closer to I think that circle of democratic policymakers than I am. So I generally agree with that view, but again, to respond, I think Sec Butch maybe came into the conversation late. But to respond, I still think that there are other long-standing U.S. national security interests. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing, to be very clear. I'm just saying if you look, take, for example, the history of the U.S.-Philippines relationship, it has always been, the core dynamic to it has been the security relationship. Whether it's, the U.S. bases or combating violent extremism, it's always been principally about the security relationship. And so it's difficult for me to imagine that some of the sort of more realpolitik national security interests will not still be very influential. Now, I hope Manpreet's correct, and that that kind of there's a reframing, a reformulation of what U.S. national security, what U.S. national security interests are in Asia. I would welcome that as somebody who's been involved in supporting democracy and human rights for a very long time. But if you look at the concern with trying to counter Chinese influence in a number of countries across the region, in order to do that, in a number of instances, it seems that the US government has decided that it has to prioritize basically good relations with the government, whether that, as I say, whether that's the government in the Philippines or in a country like Vietnam, or Bangladesh, to prioritize sort of stable relationships with those governments and de-emphasize, a very, at least public, and again, I underscore that, at least public, initiatives to strengthen or to support human rights and democracy.
Thank you, David. It was a very rich discussion. We could not answer all the questions. May I now call on Congressman Francis Gerald Blue Abaya, CALD Secretary General and member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Marites. Our esteemed panelists and guests, gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this webinar. She is the glue that holds the Liberal Party of the Philippines together. She spent the early parts of her legal profession directly working for and representing the poor and the marginalized. This experience has honed not only her legal skills, but also her developmental perspective, one that seeks to lift the condition of the majority of our countrymen who are in the fringes of society. She was an indispensable ally and equally of her husband, the late Jesse Robredo, considered by many as the most exemplary local government official of our country that has ever produced. When public governance beckoned to VP Lenny, she pursued her mandate with the same passion and dedication that marked her years as a human rights lawyer. Her one term as Congresswoman outlined her strong advocacies in the areas of participatory governance and transparency. She is one of the staunchest supporters of the Freedom of Information Act, as well as the author of such measures as the Full Disclosure Policy Bill and the People Empowerment Bill, which sought to allow more participation from Filipinos in decision and policy making. In the 2016 elections, she heeded the clamor of the people for good governance and, against all odds, mounted a national campaign in which she started from the bottom of the surveys into eventually and inevitably getting elected as our second woman vice president. Despite the lack of resources of her office and the giant fake news machinery pointed at her direction, VP Lenny has risen above the fray by quietly and efficiently marshaling the private sector to support her flagship anti-poverty programs that are felt all over the country. Her office has also single-handedly shown to everyone that the right policies and the effective use of meager resources can help in a grand manner. She has complemented the lack of government direction during this pandemic by providing essential services to our people, and most especially to the neglected frontliners in this COVID-19 crisis. As our chairman in the Liberal Party, we're very proud to associate ourselves with her brand of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, Vice President Lenny Robredo.
Thank you very much, Congressman Blue Abaya. Thank you very much to the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats for having me today. All of us who stand for democracy in the region are thankful for your commitment as you push through with this webinar despite the challenges posed by the pandemic. Today's event poses a very straightforward question. Will the 2020 US presidential elections matter for democracy and human rights in Asia? The short answer is yes, and very much so. COVID-19 has affirmed we are all interconnected. Our destinies are intertwined. When a person becomes infected, his entire community is put at risk. As more people get sick, entire healthcare systems experience strain. Businesses are forced to fold, jobs are lost, people grow hungry. The national economy plummets, and governments are left with few resources to address problems that begin to stack one on top of the other. And while this reality has only become starker due to the global health crisis, its philosophical underpinnings hold true for so many other aspects of our lives. Nowhere is this more evident than in the discourse on rights and freedoms. When rights and dignities are violated somewhere, we inch closer to rights and dignities being violated elsewhere. Tyrants become even more emboldened. Voices of dissent become a little shakier, a bit less resolved. When lies are spoken from pulpits of power, when children are seeking refuge or caged, when knees are pressed unto the necks of innocents and those in power respond by stoking further fear and division. When all of this happened in what was long considered the brightest beacon of democracy and the mightiest nation on earth, then an ominous message is sent. It can happen there. It has happened there. It can certainly happen in places where democracy is much more fragile. There is no doubt that the right-wing rise to power is a global phenomenon. Fueled by disinformation, populists tap into long-simmering fears and anxieties and paint the specter of the malevolent other. Immigrants, for example, are so-called oligarchs or drug addicts. They maintain the architecture of disinformation, further normalize aggression, and dismantle structures for truth-telling and civic discourse. They harass, jail, or even kill dissenters to stoke fear in the ranks of the opposition. They surround themselves with sycophants and weaken public institutions, further entrenching themselves in power. Populist leaders are winning elections, paving the way for others like them to rise elsewhere. Scholars have a name for it. We are going through a democracy recession as developing countries lean towards authoritarian rule. According to the 2019 Democracy Index, the average global score for democracy has been on a downward trend in the last few years, with 2019 being the worst on record since the index was first produced in 2006. Democracy has lost its footing in different parts of the globe. In some countries, the gap and distrust between government and its people continue to widen, and civil liberties such as media freedom and freedom of speech are on a steep decline. Liberals and Democrats the world over evidently face an uphill battle. And so when rights-based democracy triumphs over populist authoritarians somewhere, then the pathways become clearer for everyone else. Whenever an effort to push back against populist authoritarianism is mounted, whenever one gains success, a pocket of hope is formed. The task now is to go beyond mere hoping, beyond mere rhetoric. We must look for such instances and parse them into concrete steps and strategies. What are the best practices? How did they campaign? How did they engage the people? What messages were articulated? In which tone? Through which channels? And by whom? When they fell short, what went wrong? And how can we avoid making the same mistakes? In Turkey, for example, the democratic opposition had a better than expected showing in their 2019 local elections, winning important mayoral and gubernatorial races. How did they achieve this? By aligning along a radical love strategy, eschewing high-minded politics for local concerns, avoiding the trap of angry and divisive discourse, and always speaking from a set space of commonality with humor and humility. In the United States, the Democrats have avoided fragmentation and factionalism and have spoken directly to sensible moderates who understand what is at stake. The verdict is still out, but the momentum seems very real. Our own party, the Liberal Party, and those allied with us know that we have reoriented ourselves towards the grassroots, opening up membership to more people from all walks of life, listening to their anxieties, aligning with their dreams, and empowering them so they can empower others as well. The process is still ongoing, but we continue to move forward. The results from the elections last May of 2019 and the challenges we continue to face only deepens our resolve to strive harder, engage deeper, and aim higher in doing the work that we do. To go beyond merely seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and actually taking steps to get there. Listening, learning, organizing, putting on our slippers and our sneakers, and rolling up our sleeves to be with our communities. Much work remains, and more of us are needed to do this work. But like it is elsewhere, the momentum is real, and we are determined to sustain it. CALD, along with its sister organization, FNF, have been among our staunchest allies in our efforts. Even in the time of the pandemic, I know that our partnership has become even stronger. You have been helping us reach out to and build communities, devise modules for online media literacy, and create spaces for truth-telling and civic discourse. This webinar is just one such space. And once again, I thank CALD and FNF for putting it up and for being among our most trusted allies. May we remain bound by the same courage and resolve as we move ever forward in the coming years. Thank you very much. Mabuhay kayong lahat.
Thank you very much, VP Lenny Robredo, for that very clear and thoughtful talk. May I now request Moritz Kleine-Brockhoff, Regional Director for the FNF Southeast and East Asia Office, to close the webinar.
Thank you very much, Maritas. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President, for your address. My take is take away that no matter what kind of adversity we face, it will only strengthen our resolve. And I think that's how we all feel. So regardless what's happening in the US next year with the election results, we have to carry on. Let me close this seminar by thanking everybody involved. First and foremost, of course, everybody who shared their thoughts today. The panelists, I know it was very early for some of you and very late for others because we were stretched over many time zones. And let me also thank CALD, Lito and his staff, the Asia Center, James and his staff for making this webinar possible. I'm amazed how you guys are sort of able to keep the momentum. It's difficult in these times. It's difficult not to travel. It's difficult not to see each other face to face. And we do this on a regular basis. And I'm thankful for your ideas, for your energy, and for the continued webinars that we're able to, at least on screen, see each other and share our thoughts. Finally, let me thank Marites for moderating this event, and I look forward to seeing all of you again in a future webinar. Thank you very much on behalf of FNF. Bye-bye.
Before we end the webinar, we have the obligatory class photo, a very quick photo opportunity. And Lito, shall we have it now?
Yes, we can have it now.
Yes, just a quick photo opportunity.
Okay, my colleague Jaja would guide us in the process. Jaja, please let us know when you're taking the photo.
Okay, in a count of 1, 2, 3, okay? 1, 2, 3. Another one, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Oh, okay, thank you so much to everyone for being part of this webinar. And I don't know, Lito, if the panelists can still answer the questions in writing or till the next time.
we can send the questions to them via email.
Okay.
There are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again. So goodbye. Thank you so much I really enjoyed moderating today's webinar. Bye. Bye. Lito, shall I close this finally?
Yes.
Thank you all.
How Filipinos have long goodbyes. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Maraming salamat.
Salamat. Salamat po.
What?